with that, what I want to do very quickly is I'm going to introduce our next whole group of folks. So first up on the list from San Lorenzo Valley Water District is going to be Jen Michelson, and she'll be followed by, woo, let's have a good, we can give a woo for Jen, woo. Who, by the way, is not feeling well and still came today, so kudos to Jen, right? All right, after Jen is going to be John Ambrose from National Marine Fisheries Service to give us a regulatory. We give a woo for John, all right. All right, now, see, when I introduce the rest of these people, if you don't equally clap for them, they're going to feel really... All right, so let's hear it first. So the next, after John is going to give us a regulatory context, and we're going to take it down to the most local level. So we're going to hear from Chris Coburn from the city of Santa Cruz about what's happening at the local level. There you go, give it up for Santa Cruz. And then we're going to kind of sort of come back out to more of a regional context and hear what's being done at a regional and state level. And all of this is having to do with groundwater, surface water exchange, and that's going to be handled by Sarah Ryan, who you all know and love. So with that, if we can get the podium mic on, and you're on.
All right, thanks everyone for coming. I think most of you are ready now to be water managers. Great job. I'm going to transition us just a little bit from the talk about water budgets and groundwater to groundwater dependent ecosystems, just briefly, and then we'll talk more. The next speakers will get into more detail about that. So the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act requires that local agencies develop groundwater sustainability plans that consider the impacts of groundwater use on a variety of beneficial users. Those beneficial users include people, businesses, and the environment. And the jargon that we use for the environmental concerns are the groundwater dependent ecosystems. So we need to balance all of the benefits. And so I wanted to just describe what groundwater dependent ecosystems are, what that includes, and beginning with terrestrial vegetation. So the plants that are growing in our watershed all are dependent on groundwater. And so their roots some go deeper than others, and when we pump water, those water levels can drop, and then it can result in the vegetation dying, and then a shift of the whole habitat. And it can degrade natural habitats, and so when these natural habitats get degraded, then invasive species often will come in. So it can shift an entire ecosystem if we have the drawdown of groundwater for a long period of time. Seeps and springs are considered groundwater dependent ecosystems, and these are really important for aquatic organisms, frogs and salamanders and other kinds of critters that grow in those seeps and springs, and they're also really important. These springs are really important for temperature in the rivers. So groundwater is typically around 14 degrees Celsius, and surface water rivers are usually a little bit higher than that because they're being more impacted by the ambient air temperature. And so these springs and seeps are really important for contributing cooler waters to our rivers and keeping the habitat healthy for fish. Rivers and streams are obviously one of the ones that we have been talking about a lot today. And when we have, Georgina had a really great slide that showed the wells that were pumping next to a river, and it pulls the water down and can actually dry out a riverbed. And so that is actually happening in areas of our basin, and actually all of these concerns are happening in our basin. And so we'll have to, as part of the groundwater sustainability plan, we will be looking at all of these groundwater dependent ecosystems. And then I left one out by accident, which is estuaries, and we had mentioned that earlier. And so I wanted to apologize for that, but estuaries are another really important groundwater ecosystem, groundwater dependent ecosystem, and we have an estuary at the bottom of the San Lorenzo River, down in the city, and that's going to be an important factor as well. And so I just wanted to kind of this is just a really quick overview of this, and groundwater recharge will be a really important tool as we move forward. And so we'll be looking at groundwater recharge and how we can accomplish that in different ways. None of these decisions have been made yet. We're still in the process. And so I just wanted to let you know that recharging aquifers is going to be really important for maintaining groundwater-dependent ecosystems. And the Santa Margarita Groundwater Agency has developed a set of guiding principles that most of you probably know about. They're all printed in the break room. One of those is that beyond minimum sustainability thresholds and objectives described in the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, the Santa Margarita Groundwater Management Agency will examine possibilities to recover and restore the basin's aquifers and restore tributary base flows to the best extent possible. So that's really a good commitment from this agency. And so there is some really great resources online about groundwater-dependent ecosystems, and as we move forward developing this sustainability plan, I highly recommend that those of you who are interested in groundwater-dependent ecosystems and how we can do more in our plan to protect those, to visit this website. It's the Nature Conservancy, and it's groundwaterresourcehub.org, and there's some really great resources there all about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and how we can protect groundwater-dependent ecosystems. And then one last thing I just wanted to mention, it's getting towards the afternoon now, and there is more coffee in the break room. So I'll now introduce John Ambrose from the National Marine Fisheries Service, and he'll be talking in more detail about the rivers and the fish that we all care about so much. Thank you.
And as John's coming up, and of course throughout the session, please keep writing the questions and comments that you want, and we'll get them fed in. And then, like I said, we've got a whole half-an-hour Q&A session that we'll farm them out. If you need more cards, let me know, and I got a bunch more of the comment cards. So just keep those cards and letters coming, as they say. John?
Good afternoon, everyone. We're back from the furlough, National Marine Fisheries Service. So in my talk today, I'm going to talk about the status of coho and steelhead, our recovery plan findings. And some of these findings hopefully can be taken into consideration as the GSA moves forward with implementation of SGMA for the Santa Margarita Aquifer. For those of you that don't know, National Marine Fisheries Service is located under NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. We're located, and that's located within the Department of Commerce. We are similar to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in that we're also responsible for administration and implementation of the Federal Endangered Species Act. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has jurisdiction over terrestrial species, and we have jurisdiction over marine species. And one of the things I'd like to point out is National Marine Fisheries has always had a challenge in having a presence in Santa Cruz County because our office is in Santa Rosa, but Mandy Ingham is the supervisor for National Marine Fisheries covering this area. And Mandy, stand up real quick, let people know who you are, and we will soon or currently have a small office here in Santa Cruz in May. So we'll be able to provide better service, hopefully, than what we've been able to do in the past. I'm going to provide a quick overview for those of you that may not be familiar with the salmonid life cycle. As adults, these fish, coho and steelhead, are out in the ocean, and they come into our streams during the winter, following the winter freshets. When the sandbars breach, these fish come back to their natal streams in which to spawn. So coho come up into the streams in which they were born. They'll lay thousands of eggs, and they will die as adults. Steelhead, on the other hand, will follow coho. They'll come up and spawn, and some will die, but some will make it back out to the ocean. They can do this between 1, 2, 3 times. When the eggs hatch, they're in fresh water. This freshwater life stage is critical for the life cycle of this animal, of both species, excuse me. For coho, they're in fresh water for about a year. For steelhead, they're in fresh water, depending on water conditions, such as temperature, between 1 and 3 years. They'll move back downstream into the estuary, where they will enter the ocean and continue their life cycle. And that's how the wheel goes. So if we disrupt any portion here, the life cycle can be severely disrupted. So for Central California coast coho, steelhead, they were listed as threatened in 1997, and a recovery plan was developed in 2016. And you can look, and from this slide, hopefully you can see it, depending on what life stage they're in, they can take on very different morphologistic traits. Steelhead, CCC steelhead, Central California coast steelhead, range from Mendocino County, the headwaters of the Russian River, through San Francisco Bay, down into Santa Cruz County. Central California coast coho were listed as threatened in 1996. They were relisted as endangered in 2005. A recovery plan was developed in 2012, and they were part of our Species in the Spotlight initiative in 2015. They range from northern Mendocino Coastal County down south through Aptos Creek in Santa Cruz County. They were once present in San Francisco Bay, but they have long since been extirpated from the streams that feed San Francisco Bay. Whatever variable you look at, nobody will deny that this species has suffered a precipitous decline in California. One of the things I like to point out to the good people of Santa Cruz, you are responsible for helping get the protections in place for Central California coast coho. Your Fish and Game Advisory Commission wrote a petition to National Marine Fisheries Service, California Department of Fish and Game in 1993, and said that if these conditions are not corrected, coho would likely be extirpated from the Santa Cruz Mountains in the next 10 to 20 years. I think they would have been right, except for the fact of a chewing gum and baling wire operation, a small conservation hatchery located in Scott Creek on Kingfisher Flat that is operated by the Monterey Bay Salmon and Trout Project, and with oversight from the Southwest Fisheries Science Center that is under NOAA here in Santa Cruz. So whatever data set you look at, and this is from our most recent status review, coho are just bumping along. These are graphs, and I'm sure they're difficult to see in this light, of adult returns, but the graph on the lower left over there, that's a Scott Creek. And Scott Creek is just maintaining its population, but in our most recent status review in 2016, we did have a little bit of hope, a little bit of good news, in that the status review is better than the prior status review in 2011, in that coho were seen in streams they hadn't been seen in many, many years. So there's a little bit of hope there, and with a little bit of effort, we can really, we believe, effectuate in a positive way the recovery of this animal. We are obligated under the Endangered Species Act to develop recovery plans. These are non-regulatory documents, but they provide a roadmap for how we get these animals off the list. That's our charge. It's not to keep them listed, it's to get them off the list, to recover them, so that we can enjoy them the way our grandparents and great-grandparents did all those years ago. So we have to look at the threats that led to the decline, and we have to evaluate the current habitat conditions and come up. This thing keeps running on me. I have to talk really fast. But anyway, we're in charge of developing recovery plans. One of the things that we did for the coho plan is that we said we can't do everything everywhere. And so we highlighted, and these are the areas in red, what we call core areas. With limited restoration dollars, these are the areas that we need to focus on. And you can see that one of those areas is the streams that feed, or that are fed by the Santa Margarita Aquifer. All right. Right there are Bean and Zayante Creek. We wanted to say we need to focus on these red areas first. We can't do everything everywhere. And part of the reason we focused on Bean and Zyanthi is because juvenile coho were detected there in 2009, and again, I believe in 2012, indicating that adults came up into this watershed, spawned successfully, and produced juveniles. That's a really good thing. It's a really positive sign for the San Lorenzo. In a recovery plan, we're obligated to come up with an assessment of threats, and basically red is bad and green is good. And for the Santa Cruz Mountains, we determined that there were a number of significant threats. Residential and commercial development, roads and railroads, severe weather patterns, which includes climate change and drought, water diversions and impoundments. This is the worst graph in the world, and I apologize. I always show it and I always say I'm really sorry. The x-axis on the top, these are all columns that represent the 28 watersheds that we chose to focus on for recovery planning. And again, red represents poor habitat conditions. And 28 of the 76 watersheds where coho were historically, we're saying we're going to focus on the 28 that are most important for their recovery. This is looking at habitat variables. And out of all the streams, and just trust me on this one, out of all the streams within the 28 that we are focusing on for recovery, the San Lorenzo had the most poor ratings. It had the most challenges associated with it in terms of current habitat conditions. But that's not to say that we can't do something here. Now, here we have two similarly sized watersheds that we highlighted in our coho recovery plan. One is the 10 Mile River in Mendocino County, and the other is the San Lorenzo. And this is looking at housing density in these watersheds. The 10 Mile River is in Mendocino County. It's really easy to work in. You have essentially one land use practice, timber harvest. You have about 10 landowners. So we're working in that watershed and addressing the biggest limiting factors, which are sediment from roads and lack of in-stream habitat complexity. I used to work in this watershed for 10 years in the 1990s, and we'd rarely see coho. Now coho are distributed across the watershed in ways that I still have a hard time believing. The San Lorenzo River watershed is more of a challenge. You can see that we have a lot of people that love this river. They live on it. And the challenge that we face as managers is that when you have thousands and thousands of people, everyone manages their little piece of paradise a little bit differently than the other. And so trying to effectuate restoration and threat abatement actions is a bigger challenge. But again, it's not to say that we can't do it. And so when Sigma came out, our agency thought, finally, we're going to regulate groundwater, because this, in many watersheds, has been determined to be a significant cause in salmonid declines. Not in every watershed everywhere, but here we finally have a tool to address some of these limiting factors in certain watersheds. And of course, we again, reflecting what John said, are most concerned with the issue of surface water, groundwater interaction. National Marine Fisheries Service, we wrote a letter to DWR highlighting our concerns, and with Sigma, we think it's a good thing if it's properly implemented. However, we were concerned with a few aspects of Sigma, and particularly we said Sigma should give rise to actions that ensure streams and rivers impacted by groundwater extraction contain adequate flow for fish and other aquatic species. In other words, we're really concerned that the January 1st, 2015 baseline is inadequate.
Absolutely.
Because that represents year 4 in a 5-year drought. And as an example, in Bean Creek, where we have had coho show up, focusing restoration actions there is a little bit of a challenge if the creek goes dry. So we recognize there may be a variety of reasons why Bean Creek has gone dry. It's not necessarily simply because of groundwater extraction. It may be due to other things. It may be a natural geomorphic issue? I don't know. However, we need to find out. You have 20 years to figure this out. Another example being Carbonera Creek, outside our regulatory jurisdiction. However, Carbonera Creek, and that's because there's a waterfall and salmon and steelhead can't make it up there. However, we received a complaint on Carbonera Creek in the early 2000s. If you look at the USGS gauge data for Carbonera Creek, it used to flow in the 1990s. It doesn't flow anymore. So, in summary, some of our conclusions: the fish aren't doing so good, and we are concerned about the January 1st, 2015 baseline. We recognize that there may be other factors that cause the decline in streams, and we have to really look at that. This can't fix everything, but in watersheds where groundwater pumping is having an impact, we look at this as a great opportunity to address things that are causing the decline of the fishery. And if we look at the standards and just say, hey, January 1st, 2015, that's good enough, that's not going to meet a conservation and recovery standard for listed salmonids. I know I've run over. I apologize.
All right, so as Chris is coming up, he's going to go ahead and open up his presentation. Next, as I said, will be Chris Coburn from the City of Santa Cruz. Again, keep filing in the questions. I'm trying to segregate them around, or kind of get them into different groupings, and then we're going to have everybody come on up in a minute to, or when we do Q&A, to just kind of line up here and field different questions. So, Chris, take it away.
All right, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Really a great turnout on a, nice sunny day now. But speaking of sun, just a disclaimer to start off with. I have not been anywhere nice and sunny and fun, despite what my face may indicate. Let's just say I have a complicated relationship with my dermatologist these days. So she did save my life, so I give her a lot of deference. Anyway, so... I just want a quick poll. I know it was asked in the beginning. How many folks were here last week and heard my colleague Toby Goddard give his presentation? Last month, sorry. Thank you. So I have some slides that will be familiar. I just want to set some context with them, but I won't go into too much detail on them. But apologies that you will see a few duplicate slides and charts in particular. I'm relatively new to the city. My job there is operations manager. I've been there a little under a year now, and one of the things that really attracted me to working for the city was what I viewed as the city's commitment to really providing the tangible benefit to our community, which is providing drinking water for almost 100,000 people, but at the same time trying to balance that with ecosystem protection and protection of stream habitat values. And so it's something that I deal with on a day-to-day basis. I'll be talking about it here today, and you got a little sense of that with the work, game that you played earlier. But for me, it's a day-to-day balance in terms of overseeing both the water resources section of our department as well as the production side. So I acutely live that daily. A few main messages in case I miss anything in my presentation. I just want to set at the outset. It's obvious after the presentation we've heard today that surface water and groundwater are interconnected. The city is doing a lot of work to dedicate more water to stream for resource values to protect the salmonids that John was just talking about. Water stream flow is obviously necessary, but it's not sufficient, and I'll get into that in a little bit. Regional collaboration, and this is where the tie-in really comes, I think, into the talk that I'm giving in terms of talking about surface water, but realizing that managing surface water, in my opinion, and I think in our department's opinion, is going to depend on successful regional collaboration with groundwater agencies, because when you have departments or districts that are solely based on or using groundwater or solely using surface water, if we're not working collaboratively, I think that's going to be a detriment to all of us. And then finally, that all of you here today, it was expressed early on to go and talk to your neighbors. I know that it is a challenge for a lot of people to get out and attend these sorts of things. So to the extent that you have opportunities in your daily lives to talk to your friends, your family, your neighbors about these things and get their input and encourage them to be providing input to the process is really critical, because without that, we're not going to be successful. In a statewide perspective, I was talking with John, and I think we should really appreciate, we miss John as he left us to go to the Central Valley. He may be wishing he could come back at this point, but just a little statewide perspective on in-stream flows and water. This is what it looks like in the rest of the state. You have an unholy alliance of the city of San Francisco aligning with farmers in the Central Valley to challenge the State Water Board's new requirement that more flow be kept in the streams tributary to the Sacramento Delta for the benefit of salmonids. I can assure you one thing that's going to come out of that is a lot of lawyers are going to make a lot of money. I don't know what it's going to do for the fish, and I don't know what it's going to end up for the ratepayers and the farmers, but it's going to be contentious. And that is where we were 20 years ago, arguably, in a lot of ways. And I'm not sugarcoating things. I'm not saying there aren't still challenges, but I think we have come a long way. And hopefully I'm going to talk a little bit about that here today. So this is some of the things you saw last week, an overview of the city's water system. As I mentioned, we provide, it's almost 100,000 people drinking water 24/7, 365. Our sources are, in addition to the San Lorenzo River, we have two diversions, one at Felton and one at the Tate Street diversion, which is down closer to the city of Santa Cruz. And then really critically important are those North Coast sources, and I hope you can, there, that might be better. So those North Coast sources, Liddell, Majors, and Laguna Creeks are really critical to our water supply, because what those sources provide is high alkalinity, low organic content, and low turbidity water that we can treat, and that is really helps us deliver a high quality product to our customers. It's not a coincidence that the fish also really like those creeks because of those many same reasons. And so we are challenged with balancing our production with protecting those sources. And I'll talk about, in a very general sense, I'm not going to get into numbers today in terms of the in-stream flow work that we've been doing, but the reality is that we're keeping more flow in those creeks. In fact, these rainstorms that we've had over this last month have actually, we're actually leaving the water in the creeks now as opposed to turning it into production. And the reason we're doing that is because of these agreements that we've made with the regulatory agencies to leave more water for the fish in the streams. You saw this slide last week, just to say that we have a very widely ranging precipitation and rainfall patterns in this county, and we as a surface water agency are directly dealing with that on a year in and year out basis, and that makes production challenging. At the same time, conservation is key. Obviously, one way to keep more water in streams is to use less water overall. And so what these charts show, and I know Toby got into this last week, is to show that while connections, the number of service connections in the city of Santa Cruz water system, as well as the overall population, have increased, the total water use, which is shown on the lower graph on the lower line, shows a decrease over time. We were at one point producing over 4 million gallons a day. Right now we're at about 2.6 on an average day. So John alluded to some of the laws in place to protect salmonids. The Endangered Species Act, sorry for the acronym there, the ESA, refers to the fact that the water system must, to the extent practical, avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts to salmonids. And those impacts come from the diversions that we have on these streams that are producing our surface water. And so in addition to that, we have pipeline maintenance, other construction activities, watershed management. All of those are what's considered covered activities, which I'll get into on the next slide, but all those are being incorporated into something called a habitat conservation plan. And so that is something that the city has been negotiating with NOAA National Marine Fisheries for 12 plus years in terms of what are we going to do to achieve those avoidance, mitigation, and minimization requirements that the ESA have for us. And where we can't do all of those things, the city is also developing what we're calling a non-flow conservation fund, which will be a pot of money that's going to be used. I mentioned that stream flow is necessary, but it's not sufficient. If you're throwing a whole bunch of water into the creek and there's not the habitat there, and John alluded to that with, I think, his multicolored chart there, is that we need habitat complexity. We need wood in the streams. We need other things that will provide that habitat that fish will rely on when the stream flow when we have more stream flow in the creeks. So then, again, the covered activities are the water diversions, routine operations, pipeline repair and maintenance, and the like. Related to the habitat conservation plan is the city has, some of you may be aware, we recently issued a notice of preparation for an environmental impact report where we're seeking to amend our water rights. Part of that is related to the habitat conservation plan in that in those water rights petitions, we are committing more water. Some of our water rights currently do not require us to bypass any water past our diversion for salmonids. We are changing that in those water rights petitions where we will be putting more water into the creek, bypassing more water, and also giving us greater flexibility to use that water in different sources, and that relates to the regional water collaboration that I hope to see. This is just a graph, a very sort of snapshot in terms of, let's see, the June fish flow bypass chart. All I'm really seeking to show here is that even in dry years, which I'm sorry the colors are probably washed out, but in some of the darker colors to the left of that, you can see that even in those dry years, the city is bypassing flow. At the same time, we're producing water. And so this again speaks to the work that we're attempting to do to balance the environmental protection with the water production on a daily basis. And again, speaking to there needs to be habitat values associated with these in-stream flows that we're contributing to the creeks and rivers. One of the things that the city has been working on in collaboration with the Resource Conservation District, the city, the county, and the Coastal Watershed Council is an effort called San Lorenzo 2025 Partnership. And what that is a loose collaboration amongst those entities and others to seek to bring resources to our county, to our watershed, to implement habitat restoration projects. So we've hosted a series of tours. We've brought, when you're faced usually in November with a choice of voting for a bond, an environmental water bond or something like that at the state level, if those are passed, those bonds turn into funds that can be used for habitat restoration. And so we're seeking to grease the wheel, so to speak, in terms of bringing those funds to our county and our watershed. Some examples of that work, large woody debris placement, really just mimicking the natural sort of processes that would occur in watersheds by cost effectively, hopefully, putting stream wood or large woody debris into creeks. It really does a lot to increase channel complexity for the benefit of salmonids, in addition to sorting sediment and having other benefits. Rural roads maintenance is a big thing. Sediment, particularly fine sediment, is a real challenge and something that we're trying to minimize. Lagoon management. If the water flows down to the lagoon, Jen mentioned the real importance of the estuaries, and certainly the San Lorenzo River estuary lagoon is very critical for salmonid. The steelhead like to go down there and fatten up and grow, and it's really critical to their survival that they do that. And so if the conditions aren't there, if the water temperature is too high, if there's no oxygen in the water, or if someone artificially breaches the lagoon, which tends to occur, especially when it looks like it does in this picture where it's almost full, you get those artificial breaches that catastrophically can wash fish out into the ocean before they're ready to go. And so the city has, working with the Resource Conservation District, sought funding to implement a project to address some of those challenges. Fortunately, they were successful with the grant application. Unfortunately, the bids came in twice as much for the project when it went out to bid. So we're seeking additional funding to implement that project. And finally, just some related efforts that the city has been working on with a number of partners. Many of those I've just mentioned, including the RCD, the county, the Coastal Watershed Council, CAL FI, and others, working on Drinking water sanitary survey, we actually did that recently in partnership with the San Lorenzo Valley Water District, where we're seeking to evaluate what are the threats to our surface water production. Karst protection, again, working with San Lorenzo Valley Water District. The karst formation on Ben Lomond Mountain is really critical to providing that cold water supply that support not only production but also fish and habitat values. Fire, it's nice and wet and cold out right now, but in not too long we're going to be in that fire season again. It's hard to think that we ever really get out of it. But fire protection effort, the pictures there show a shaded fuel break. It's basically trying to minimize the potential for catastrophic fire in the watershed, not only for obviously water supply, but for life and property and all those other things as well too. So I am out of time. But happy to answer questions, I guess, at the end after we're all up here. Thank you.
Okay, as Sierra's heading up there to pull her presentation up, thank you again for the questions and comments that have already been coming up. If you've got others, please send them in. We've already got a pretty good stack of them, but we'll take them as many as you got, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. So. Sierra?
All right. So I just had to adjust the microphone because Chris is like 9 feet tall. All right. So my name's Sierra Ryan. I work for the County of Santa Cruz. I am also staffing both the Santa Cruz Mid-County Groundwater Agency and the Santa Margarita Groundwater Agency. So I'm kind of steeped in groundwater, so to speak. I'm going to try today to tie together some of the things you've heard and kind of put them under the context of how we're actually going to be applying them. With our plan, with our groundwater sustainability plan to meet the requirements of SGMA, as well as benefit the basin kind of beyond just the minimum. So as you've heard, there are 6 undesirable results that you are trying to avoid when you're developing your groundwater sustainability plan. Each of these ones individually has a threshold, a minimum threshold. If you go below that minimum threshold, you are considered unsustainable and you're in trouble with the state. Above the threshold, you have your objective, which is where you actually want to get to. We're going to be talking today about undesirable result number 6, which is the interconnected surface water. So some considerations kind of statewide under SGMA. You have to consider the needs of all the surface water users. So the theme today is how do we balance all needs? This is kind of where that comes into account. You have to determine whether the depletion of surface water is having a significant and unreasonable impact on those users. As John Ambrose mentioned, conditions cannot get worse than they were on January 1st, 2015, but as he also mentioned, that is not a really high bar to reach. Also, this is widely considered to be kind of the most complicated of those 6 indicators. So if you're feeling kind of overwhelmed today, you are not alone. This is a very complicated issue. I have here an extremely simplified set of graphics to show you how an interconnected surface water body works in terms of the relationship between the surface water, the creek here, and the groundwater basin. So you might have recognized these terms. If the groundwater level's higher than or at the same level as the creek, then you'll have a gaining stream where the groundwater is feeding that stream. If it's lower than the creek, you'll have a losing stream where the groundwater basin is actually being fed by the surface water source. And the gradient at which that difference is can make a big difference in terms of what your base flow is. As you continue pumping, you can end up with a disconnected surface water where the relationship is really just one direction. The surface water is always feeding the groundwater basin, and it's basically a free flow at whatever rate the subsurface geology will allow. And then ultimately, you can end up with a system where streams will go dry because that pumping has made such a difference in the space between the surface water and the groundwater. So John had spoken about the importance of flow for salmonids and many of the other users of the surface water as well. So when you're considering what influences stream flow, it's a whole suite of factors. You've got rainfall and runoff from the watershed, you've got the surface water diverters, you've got surface water management, some of the stuff Chris was talking about, evapotranspiration has come up before. interflow, which is kind of this, just the soil wetness, kind of the sponge of the top part of the surface. You have subsurface geology, which has a huge role to play. And then you have groundwater extractions and groundwater levels. And of these, the only thing the Groundwater Sustainability Agency has real authority over and can manage is this last one, the groundwater extractions and levels. And so because of that, most groundwater sustainability agencies are moving towards this idea of trying to use a groundwater level adjacent to the stream as a proxy for making sure that you are that will be your measurement for your sustainability indicator. So rather than trying to make it direct flow, because there are so many things that can impact flow, we are going back to this, and we're considering, okay, if we can get our groundwater levels adjacent to the stream to be at or above whatever measure we set, then that is what we are going to be measuring for. I know that's a confusing concept. We can get more into it in questions if you want, but I want to make sure that I talk a little bit about what we're doing in the Santa Cruz Mid-County Groundwater Basin. So they're considered a critically overdrafted basin, which means their groundwater sustainability plan has to be released in January of next year, like less than a year from now. And so the draft has to be done actually pretty soon. We're talking maybe July. So because of that, we're already, up and running on this indicator. So I want to show you a little bit of what we've done there. The first thing is, we're characterizing the basin. We're identifying all these surface water users because that's one of the things we need to balance. So as Jen had mentioned, groundwater dependent ecosystems is a huge consideration. We used that map, the Groundwater Resources Hub map that she had referred to that the Nature Conservancy had put up, and we identified where we had those ecosystems. We also took the California Natural Diversity Database to look at species-specific areas that we wanted to make sure that not only are we looking at the ecosystems, we're looking at the species that we're concerned about. And we came up with a list of species and ecosystems that we are of most concerned about. And then we prioritize them for management under this effort. Not saying that anything's not a priority, but we have some kind of lowest common denominators where we assumed if we're meeting the needs of those ecosystems and species, the other dependent ecosystems and species are also having their needs met. And so this was an effort done not only by staff, but we had a working group that included fisheries biologists, we had NOAA was involved, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, as well as a bunch of local experts. We also had to look at surface water users in terms of human users. In this area, in the Mid-County Basin, there actually aren't that many surface water users, but there are people who have a right to use the surface water, so we had to take that into account as well. And the next step in characterization, this whole point is to look at interconnected surface waters, not every surface water in the basin, because if it's not connected to groundwater, then nothing we do to the groundwater basin is going to make a difference. So this is a result of our modeling work, and it characterizes how connected the surface water is to the groundwater. And then we also had to locate the pumping centers, because that's what we have control over, really, is where are we having extractions from the groundwater. Those are the areas we want to make sure that we're paying close attention to, and when it comes to our monitoring. So getting back to our criteria here, the first step is to define what is considered unsustainable. What is your significant and unreasonable condition? And in the Mid-County Basin, this is the draft statement. It has not been fully vetted yet, but their statement is that the lowering of groundwater levels adjacent to interconnected streams supporting special status species due to groundwater extraction, so there's some qualifiers there, that results in a significant decrease in stream-based flow during the period from June to October would be a significant and unreasonable condition. So that, any one of these things, if we find ourselves in this position, we are unsustainable and we have to change direction quickly. The next steps in this basin, we have to develop our objectives, and these are measurable, these are numbers. We need to come up with our minimum threshold, that line below which we cannot go, and then we need to figure out how we're going to monitor this. So that's going to include shallow monitoring wells adjacent to the stream so that we can check that, and we're also going to be doing more stream gauging. So here in our basin, comparing the two, in a lot of ways they have a lot in common. Both basins have surface water that supports special status species, and here we really are most concerned with the salmonids. We also have groundwater extractions from both municipal and public wells. But here in the Santa Margarita Basin, we have a lot more surface water diverters too. And we have a lot less agricultural and commercial use. So these two basins they're not the same. We also don't have seawater intrusion that we're considering. So some of these principles, our approach is likely going to be similar, but it's not going to be identical because this in particular of all of the indicators, I think is very site specific. So some additional takeaways. The GSP is exempt from CEQA. You cannot ignore the Endangered Species Act or the Public Trust Doctrine. I know some basins, some GSAs may think that they can because by the minimum standards set out by SGMA, you can just keep your levels at January 2015. And if the fish were dying then, who cares? That is not, I don't think that's okay. Nobody in this basin thinks that's okay. I don't think that those other GSAs are going to be very successful with that strategy either. But as Jen said, here in the Santa Margarita, we have our guiding principles, and one of them, I'm not going to read the whole thing because Jen already did, but we will examine the possibilities to recover and restore the basin's aquifers and restore tributary base flows to the best extent possible. Another great thing about SGMA is it's really helping us to coordinate this regional approach to water within the basin, and I think that's going to be a really important component when it comes to recovering the base flows. And recovering groundwater levels, it is going to lead to an improvement in stream flow in interconnected streams. So my last point here is that if this topic is important to you, and I think it probably is, please come to our meetings. Come to all of them. Make sure that your voices are heard, so that we can set these. We need to set these goals. We're going to be starting these discussions soon, and we really need community input. So I guess that's all. We can move on to questions.